15 liters, but it fits an mATX board. Let's talk about one of the big features for the M1 Evo. Welcome to Machines More. So it is a bona fide SFF case, but you can build with a micro ATX board. And that gives builders plenty of options, certainly much more than just being limited to mini-itx. As an example, in Ryzen 7000 space, you have considerably more options for, say, B650 boards. For B650 boards in micro ATX space, they range from more budget offerings to some of the nicer ones, such as the one I'm building with, which is the Gigabyte B650M Aorus Elite. Now, the best part is even a higher spec board like this is priced at about $180 US recently. So compare that to the equivalent Aorus Elite B650 ITX board, which is about $250, and that isn't as nice or complete a board as the mATX version, and you really could put that savings towards a nicer graphics card, for example. That's not to say building with the mATX board comes without some serious considerations though. So the objective today, I'm going to show you a liquid-cooled and also an air-cooled mATX build. We'll keep the cooling specs as comparable and similar as possible to our initial review with the mini-itx board, and you'll see some of the limitations, and we'll compare performance data to see what's possible with a micro ATX build. So let's get started. We want to make sure that the standoffs are in the mATX position. The mATX board does take up the entire height of this case. So when we turn it this way, you'll see that there are some limitations when it comes to fan placement at the top, and that will also affect our ability to put a radiator at the top. So with this build here and this power supply, I've got it mounted up in the rock solid position, meaning the power supply cage is anchored to the frame of the case, okay, over here, and that way this does not move. It's very solid. However, that does prevent us from being able to use even a 2mm fan adjacent to the motherboard. Now, that even if you shifted out the power supply to the front here and you are able to fit that fan, that's not going to do you much good, because you can see it's overlapping about 3/4 of the fan. So this is going to be, not only is it going to cause noise from turbulence, you're not going to get any airflow from that. You are able to, cable management permitting, you can see you do lose the ability if you had to have a cable terminal on the inside here, you wouldn't be able to fit the fan, but in this case I am just able to place this here. Okay, you do have to watch out that nothing interferes with that fan though, so you have to be careful with your cable management. All right, so you only get 2 screws, and some of you may not be comfortable with that. If your board has a bigger heatsink at the top, you will be limited in terms of a top 120mm fan. Over the PSU, you will still be able to fit a slim fan here, noting that you could theoretically shift the PSU down for a thicker fan up here, but then that thicker fan may interfere with cable headers on the motherboard, and you will lose the 92mm fan underneath that's next to the motherboard. With most boards, you will want to be using the topmost expansion slot, which is typically your X16 slot. So even a thicker 3-slot card like the 6800XT I have here, there's still enough room for bottom 25mm fans, and those are very helpful. Got these fans hooked up directly to the headers at the bottom, so there's really little clutter with this mATX board. You can't do this with a mini-itx board because there's no headers in that position. The board doesn't extend this far, and that's really neat. So we'll take full advantage of that with our bottom fans, which will be running as an intake to feed cool air to our graphics card. In this scenario, the fans aren't right up against the GPU coolers, so that's okay in terms of turbulence. Now, it would have been nicer if there was a little bit more breathing room, yeah. All right, so first off, let's talk about the liquid-cooled build, and that's the one I did first with this guy here, the PL240 Flux. This is the white one from Cooler Master. One important thing to note here is that with an mATX board, you aren't basically limited to one single radiator configuration. That is a side mount. Also, since you can't fit the power supply flat next to the motherboard, you're basically limited to a 240mm rad. Since the front mounted power supply position, that's going to interfere with a 280. So, not too many options there. Not to worry though, there are plenty of good 240s out there, and like this one, the one I'm building with, this is the white edition that I used in my initial test for the M1 Evo. So we're going to stick with it just for consistency. This one is ranked among some of the best 240s on the market currently. And as mentioned, there's really no choice to mount a top radiator because of that. And also, if you were saying, I'm just going to mount the radiator on the bottom, that's really going to be tricky. So I know some of you might have questions about this configuration, if this is possible, right? Bottom mounted radiator, because we can't mount it at the top. We only have that side option. Does it work? Well, even with something that would work traditionally at the bottom, I'll explain why this doesn't work. Because in this position, you can't get your card in, right? This is too thick. Even if you could, it's kind of weird to have your radiator fans feeding your GPU fans directly. Okay. And so, yeah, technically, I think you could put slim fans here and put the card in the traditional position there. This case does take a vertical GPU, so you theoretically could also do this, right? But then this usually mounts at the bottom. So even if you could somehow attach it to here, there's no provision for kind of a floating GPU, vertical GPU mount here. It'd be nice if it did, but there's no way to do that currently. Vertical GPUs are not going to work unless you have a combination of a 120mm radiator and a very short card. Next up, let's take a look at a simple air-cooled build. This is with a U9S here, running the same configuration as our mini-itx testing with the 7800X 3D. So you'll notice that the socket position is more inwards versus a mini-itx board. So we do shift farther away from the rear panel. Whether you are intaking or exhausting there, completely your choice. Of course, you will lose a tiny bit of efficiency there. We do have a rear 92mm that we can deploy in that position to help bridge that gap. But because of the more inward socket position, you also do run into a constraint when it comes to a side panel fan here. Got the T30 mounted up here on the side as a side exhaust. One thing to note, it's very tight with where the U9S is and the power supply. So actually, the fan is touching the heatsink. Take a look at an ITX board, right? This is where the socket would be if I'm kind of aligning it with a similar position, and that would place the heatsink a lot closer to here, and this wouldn't be an issue with a push-pull and also the side panel fan. So there is that consideration there. If you wanted to run a outboard fan, like a push-pull on the U9S, right, because here you have 25mm, so you can just shift the fan over. Of course, keeping in mind, if you did have a fan over here that's being obstructed by the power supply, you're going to lose some of the airflow. So most likely, if you wanted to run that additional 25mm fan here, you'd lose about 25mm of the fan's airflow there directly against the power supply. That actually might cause some turbulent noise too, so probably not a good idea. Slim fan, probably the best choice here. So if you wanted to put a slim 120 and a push-pull, that could work. As with the liquid-cooled build, we also do lose the ability to shift the motherboard up to get the GPU the most amount of breathing room. So running 25mm fans underneath the card, that's going to make the most out of our case thermals. Okay, so thermal data compared to the mini-itx build, there's going to be a bit of a difference. For CPU-only testing with the same cooler and fans, same RPMs here. The gap going from two 25mm top exhaust to a single slim top exhaust, and going from two 25mm side panel fans to one single 92mm fan, it's about 2.5 degrees, which actually it's not too bad, especially considering you don't have to buy those extra fans either. If you are pushing the limits of a 240, such as with a 7900X or 7950X though, the thermal gap there may well be the difference, the thermal difference for thermal throttle in a heavy multi-thread scenario. But otherwise, for users with lower powered CPUs, that isn't likely to be a noticeable gap. For air cooling, recall we switched to the 7800X 3D. Small gap here with the CPU thermals and the associated boost clocks on stock PBO. So this is going to be a combination of the cooler setup being a bit farther away from the rear panel, as well as the loss of the, the two full 120mm motherboard side panel fans. It's not a huge difference, but doing some PBO curve optimizer improvements could definitely be a good call here. In a combined use scenario with 1440p gaming, you're just comparing with the maxed out mini-itx setup with your two top slim fans, two bottom fans, and two side panel fans. There's a very big thermal gap in terms of the GPU thermals. CPU thermals, it's not going to be a big difference one way or another. The loss of being able to run 220mm by 25mm top exhaust is pretty critical though, because even if we just compare to a mini-itx build with only 2 top exhausts, the GPU thermals are still better there than in our mATX test where we have 2 bottom fans and still with that single slim at top exhaust. And inverting the case, it's gonna help a lot here. I've tested it already, but since that's not necessarily specific to mATX and didn't want to make this video too long, I will cover that in its own video. So yeah, with liquid cooling, thermals aren't gonna be as good. How about the air-cooled build? So compared to the mini-itx air-cooled build, we have 2 top exhausts there and 2 fans next to the motherboard. No bottom fans needed since we can raise the GPU up considerably all the way up with the motherboard to give it a lot of breathing room. And yeah, we're seeing the same thing here. You get better GPU thermals and more or less the same CPU thermals. So to sum it up, if finding a suitable mini-itx board is difficult, or you feel the flexibility of board choice outweighs the flexibility of board positioning in this case, or the board is cost prohibitive, then yeah, I would absolutely go for it. Now, I don't think the thermal penalty is a deal breaker here, nor is it extreme. Another takeaway, some constraints for your cooling solutions. If you are intending on running a 13900K or 7900X, something heavy like that, I would absolutely recommend a suitable mini-itx board, since that will allow you to use a 280mm radiator with this case. And I think the extra cost will be worth it, since with a 240 you really are riding close to the thermal limits there. So hope you found that helpful. We will be talking about inversion soon, so make sure you are subscribed. Please give a like if you found this video helpful. I will be leaving some component links down below. Big thanks for watching.